Just say it, man. Don't make me ask 20 questions.
What is the point?
Get to the point.
Just say it already!
Welcome to the Podcram. Let's listen to Dr. David Yeager discuss the growth mindset on Huberman Lab. If you're liking this line of thinking, it pairs well with episode 15 of the Podcram, which covers Lisa Feldman Barrett's revolutionary work on emotions.
Dr. David Yeager, welcome. Can you tell us your definition of growth mindset?
Yeah, so it's simply the belief that your abilities or your potential in some domain can change. A huge confusion is people think it means if you try hard, then you can do anything. But that's not really the idea. It's simply that under the right conditions with the right support, change is possible. And, that ends up being a pretty powerful idea because the opposite is so stressful, right? The idea that you are static, nothing about you can change is really kind of a stressful idea.
Carol Dweck is the originator of the growth mindset idea as a field, and she deserves tremendous credit for that.
I want to tell you about the power of yet. I learned in high school in Chicago where students had to pass 84 units to graduate, and if they didn't pass, they got the grade not yet. I thought, isn't that wonderful? Because if you fail, you're nowhere. But if you get the grade not yet, you're on a learning curve. Not yet gave them a path into the future. And not yet also helped me understand a critical experience early in my career. To figure out how kids coped with challenge, I gave 10-year-olds some problems that were a little too difficult for them. Some of them reacted in a shockingly positive way. They said things like, I love a challenge. They understood that their abilities could grow through their hard work. They had what I call a growth mindset. But other children, for them it was tragic, catastrophic. From their more fixed mindset perspective, their core intelligence had been tested and devastated. Instead of the power of yet, they were gripped by the tyranny of now. So, what did they do next? In one study, after a failure on a test, they said they'd cheat next time instead of study more. In another study, they found someone who did worse than they did so they could feel better. And in many studies, we found they run from difficulty. So, what can we do? How can we build that bridge to yet? First, we can praise wisely. Our research shows that when we praise kids for the process they engage in, their hard work, their strategies, their focus, their perseverance, they learn that challenge seeking, they learn that resilience. Praising talent, praising intelligence makes them vulnerable. There are other ways of rewarding yet. We teamed up with game scientists at the University of Washington to create a math game, Brain Points. The typical math game rewards right answers right now, but not brain points. We rewarded process and the learning curve, so effort, strategy, and progress. The Brain Points game created more sustained learning and greater perseverance than the standard game. And just the words yet and not yet after a student has a setback, we're finding creates greater confidence and greater persistence. We also can change students' mindsets directly. In one study, we taught students that every time they pushed out of their comfort zone to learn something really, really hard and they stuck to it, the neurons in their brain could form new, stronger connections, and over time, they could become smarter. Those who learned this lesson showed a sharp increase in their grades. Those who did not showed a decrease. We have done this with thousands of students now across the country with similar results.
There are a lot of interesting growth mindset mechanism studies. My personal favorite is a study by David Nussbaum and Carol Dweck. It's on defensiveness versus remediation. And the basic idea is, in a fixed mindset, the idea that your intelligence cannot change, you are the way you are, it can't change. Your goal in that fixed mindset is to defend your ego, to hide your deficiencies or any flaws, because if they're fixed and then they're revealed, then it labels you for life in some way as less than, shameworthy, etc. Right. In a growth mindset, though, a mistake is part of the process. It's just an opportunity to grow.
I have questions about these brief 25-minute, I think you said, interventions.
In that 25 minutes, how are you communicating in a way where someone's ears are open, where they're not feeling talked down to, ashamed, humiliated, etc.? But then the second step is saying that to you at a time when it's possible for there to be what we call a recursive process or a snowball effect that's going to happen over time. We often do the following three things. First is we present some new scientific information, some idea that almost in a Gladwell way is not obvious and intuitive to the reader, but feels like new information and useful information. So the first is a scientific. The second is we present participants with stories from people like them who've used those ideas in their lives and found them useful. So in the concrete case of 9th graders getting growth mindset, it's 10th, 11th, 12th graders who previously felt dumb, learned a growth mindset, then felt better. It's more complicated than that. That's the basic idea. Mm-hmm. And last, we don't just tell them the stories. We ask, third, for participants to author a story. So they write a narrative about a time when they struggled, a time when they doubted themselves, and then remembered this idea that people can change, my brain can grow, etc. So the 3 points are scientific information, stories, or the technical term is descriptive norms. So you're giving people information about what's normal for people like you. And then the third is the writing, which we call saying is believing. That's a popularized version of a term that came from classic social psychologists, Josh Aronson, Elliot Aronson, who found in the work on cognitive dissonance 30, 40 years ago that one of the best ways to change someone's mind about something is to ask them to try to persuade somebody else. So what is the science in the growth mindset? That's where we draw on the metaphor that the brain is like a muscle, that just like muscles get stronger when they're challenged and can, recover, so too does the brain get smarter when it's pushed and challenged in a certain way. In a 2016 paper in PNAS, Greg, Walton, and I explained these types of interventions as we call them a lay theory intervention. And the idea there is that our intuitive theories for explaining the world help us anticipate what something means. The idea from basic developmental psychology is that human beings are walking around with kind of prior belief about objects, about motion, about number, and then later about complex social structures like whether people are looking down on me, where I stand relative to others, and also little lay theories about adversity. What does it mean when I have to put in effort? What does it mean when I fail? So the idea is that if you understand the theory someone has, then you'll understand the meaning they'll make about a future experience. And the reason meaning matters is because the way you interpret something then affects how you respond to it, right? So if I see someone and they're doing something innocuous, but I interpret it as a threat, do I call the police? Do I run away? That's my interpretation. That's causing it, right? It turns out one of the best ways to preset someone's meaning and give them a different theory is to give them a different story. Stories are kind of like theories in motion. Mm-hmm. This is why, what's the point of War and Peace, right? War and Peace is really a theory of great leaders in the war. You learn the theory in a narrative way, right? So this is a classic idea throughout human history. Great writers and authors give us theories through narrative, right? And so we're just taking that simple human fact and doing it in a 10-minute activity. And the lay theory in a person's mind that when things are difficult, it can change, can be taught with a very simple narrative, which is, this person or even I experienced difficulty on something that mattered to me. That difficulty didn't determine my entire future because actually there were steps that I could take in order to make a difference. Here are the steps that I took, and then it improved. So we give them some touch points, and we think that once people do that in our writing exercises, they're more likely to see that pattern out in the world. And if you see that enough, and then you take the actual steps to get better, then it starts becoming true for you. And that's called the recursive process.
I feel like so much of getting better at things involves reappraising the stress or anxiety response. The friction that one feels when they can't perform something well or when things feel overwhelming or confusing. And I think the analogies to physical exercise apply, but I feel like they're limited in the sense that I like the idea that the brain is like a muscle, that it can grow and get stronger. I think the key difference to my mind is that working out with weights, you get some sense of the result you're going to get because there's like a lot of blood flow into the muscle. So it's like a hint of what's possible. With cardiovascular exercise, like if we run hard up a hill, there's that moment where your lungs are burning, et cetera. And anyone who understands exercise knows that that's the signal for adaptation, such that the next time you can do the same thing without the burning of the lungs.
Right.
When it comes to mental work and learning, I think we immediately assume that if we're not performing well, if we're getting confused or overwhelmed, that somehow we're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
As opposed to stimulating the growth.
Right.
Are there any studies that point to bridging the relationship between the physiology, the stress response, and the mindset that allows one to say, okay, this is really hard and I keep failing and failing and failing at this math, at this language learning, at writing this essay, whatever it is. And that's exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. It's like the burning of the lungs, or it's like the failure to complete another repetition in the gym.
The standard growth mindset message does have reappraisal components, specifically around something Carol Dweck has called effort beliefs, which is very simply the belief that if it's hard, it means you're doing the wrong thing. And that follows naturally from the fixed mindset idea that ability can't change. And I think it's very important to point out the centrality of that effort belief, because people have tried to apply growth mindset, but simplified it in a way of just saying, basically try harder, right? Or I believe in you. If you try hard enough, you can do anything. Right. But if your natural inclination is to view the need for effort as a sign that you are doing the wrong thing, that's the default interpretation, then people are going to quit, right? If you believe effort outs you as lacking potential, and then I say you need to try hard, I'm saying you don't have potential. That basic insight is very poorly misunderstood in the field, and it's led to tons of misapplications of Carol's work. And then people are like, well, this thing doesn't work. Well, you haven't addressed the effort belief. You can't just abstractly tell someone your brain is a muscle and assume that magically, then in the midst of stress and frustration and confusion and all those negative experiences, that you're going to immediately say, yes, I love doing this and this is great. But then there's also the physiological component, as you're saying. When we're stressed, frustrated, confused, your heart starts racing. Maybe your palms get sweaty, right? Your breathing, starts getting heavier. My daughter, who's 13, before like a cello audition, it's like, I have butterflies in my stomach. I don't, what does this mean? And I think that growth mindset research didn't always deal with the visceral experience of stress and frustration. In a world in which someone hears the growth mindset message and says, yes, now I'm going to go challenge myself. I'm going to embrace stress and frustration, do the mental equivalent of, running ladders or running up a hill. Then they feel that stress, but if they don't know how to interpret that, it's like growth mindset isn't going to get them to the skill development, right? Or at least to the mental well-being of feeling like they have confidence and can do well. In some research that we've done in the last few years, what we've tried to do is to marry together the growth mindset idea with great work originally coming out of Ali Crum and Jeremy Jameson's labs, who were building on lots of great appraisal psychologists, Wendy Mendez and others, to say, okay, in the inevitable experience where if you fully believe our growth mindset and then now you load your plate with challenges, but now you've got a physiological stress response, how are you going to appraise that better? And that's kind of been the new frontier of growth mindset work in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, could you tell us more about this stress is enhancing mindset? I think it's a really interesting one, especially when it's woven in with the growth mindset.
An experience of your heart racing, your palms sweating, anxiety in your stomach, that is itself a new stressor that then needs to be interpreted and appraised by the person experiencing it. Mm-hmm. That idea on its own is kind of revolutionary for people. People tend to think that your physiological arousal is this objective experience that is universally bad. Ali Crum calls that a stress is debilitating belief. That's a good label for it. It's this idea that heart racing, palms sweaty, butterflies in your stomach is a sign of your impending failure and doom, and it will always interfere with your performance. And the implication, therefore, is if you were about to do well on whatever you're going to do, then you wouldn't feel that way. Ali Crum calls this being stressed about being stressed. And that, I think it's a really common experience right now where people are like, wow, if I was a confident, good person who was about to do well, I wouldn't be sitting here feeling so stressed about how stressed I am. And it becomes this metacognitive layered loop of just being stuck in your own mind and interpreting your arousal in the most negative possible light. So people aren't like wrong for having come to that belief because it's everywhere in our culture. One thing I do in my class a lot is I just have people Google image search stress management memes. And first of all, a surprising number about cats. I don't know why people think cat pictures are like the way to convey complex scientific ideas. Like it'll be like a cat with like a cookie jar and it'll be like growth mindset. I don't understand what the point of that is. But page 2 or 3 after all the cats, then you get to a lot of things that are, you'll see a person with a battery that's empty and it's like they didn't de-stress, or 10 tips for de-stressing. And it'll be like, go on a walk, drink chamomile tea. Like the underlying implication is that if you're stressed, then you need to distract yourself. You need to get rid of that stress. But an alternative explanation in the growth mindset world is, well, maybe you have something that's very important to you and you've pushed yourself to embrace some challenge in a really admirable way. And that has filled your plate in some way. Like if I was about to give a presentation to a senior vice president at work and I'm stressed about it, I should not like go take a bubble bath and like go for a walk. Like I should get ready to kick ass at the presentation, And so I think what Ali Crum and others have identified is that you can think differently about that stress. You can say, this is actually a sign that I'm preparing to optimize my performance. And maybe the heart racing isn't my body being afraid of damage. Maybe it's my body getting more oxygenated blood to my brain and my muscles to like help me do really well. And that's called a stress can be enhancing belief. If you're in the stress is debilitating mindset, you don't realize that there's an alternative. You just think that that's the way it is. So it never occurs to you to say, oh, this stress is helping me. But once you tell people this, what happens is in our studies, we actually see a change in stress physiology. Changing your mindset about stress in turn changes how your body reacts, which then becomes a different stressor that you can interpret. And so the big insight was pairing these ideas about reframing stress as an inevitable force that's going to destroy your goal pursuit into a resource to be cultivated, and pairing that together with the first step, which is the growth mindset that causes you to be open to the challenge in the first place.
I feel like so much of what human beings struggle with, such as learning and performance, our relationship to stress, etc., could be resolved if we could overcome the deficit in language. Here's what I'm thinking. We're talking about reframing stress to make it performance enhancing as opposed to performance diminishing. I wonder if we replace the word stress with just like levels of arousal. But then people hear arousal and they think certain kinds of arousal. So what we want to do is, the way I think about it is like a continuum of readiness. But then that doesn't work because readiness could be readiness for sleep, which is a low level of arousal. You don't want to be highly alert, and then you're not ready for sleep, right?
Yeah.
So there's a real deficit of language where I think if there was some other word, I can't come up with it on the fly, where, one's internal level of readiness as opposed to stress, and maybe it looks a lot like autonomic arousal where heart rate is increased and blood pressure is increased, and people would say, oh yeah, that's my body being ready for something as opposed to stressed about doing it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a trivial, recasting of stress on the one hand, but in terms of kids learning about life and stress and arousal and these internal signals and adults learning about those and incorporating those into their life goals, I think it would be pretty meaningful. And I don't have a solution to this, but I feel like everyone hears stress is bad. You hear stress is enhancing. Okay, great. But I think it's really about developing a language that lets us interpret what's going on in our bodies and compare that to what we are facing in the moment and just decide, is this well matched or poorly matched to what we need to do? Is it great for going to sleep? Is it great for learning? Is it great for catching that train that's soon to leave the station? And I just wonder why the deficit in language.
I think it's a profound question because small changes in language perpetuate problematic lay theories because they have the baggage on them. Let's think this through. So what the psychophysiologists like to point out is that there's a distinction between the stressor, which is let's call it the internally or externally imposed demand. Could be something that's thwarting your goals, or
the exam, the difficult conversation,
right.
For some people going to the doctor or the dentist,
the hard conversation with somebody you care about, or a physical stressor, right? Like a football game or running a marathon, right? So anything that imposes demands on your body and mind, and therefore will require resources, metabolic resources to do well. That's a stressor, okay? Then there's your appraisal of it. That's what you name it, how you interpret it, how you frame it in your mind. And then there's your response. People in general conflate the stressor with the stress response when they say stress. They're like, I'm really stressed right now. Well, what you mean is that there were stressors, you appraised them as more than you can handle, and then you had a threat-type stress response, which means that your body is preparing for damage and defeat. And that is like an inheritance of how the sympathetic nervous system evolved, which was to keep us alive from threats, mainly physical threats. And so if you have a stressor, some demand, praise is something you cannot handle, and then your threat-type response, your body's basically assuming you're going to lose whatever physical fight you're in, like the bear's going to tear you apart. And then your main goal at that point is to stay alive and like bleed out more slowly, right? Mm-hmm. So you end up with more blood kept centrally in the body cavity, less in the extremities, right? The body releases cortisol because it's an anti-inflammatory. It's going to like help with tissue repair 45 minutes down the road. So there's a whole like cascade of physiological responses that come in part from the mental appraisal that this stressor is more than you can handle. Now, we're very rarely confronted with those kinds of physical stressors these days. It's often social stressors. But a lot of these social stressors are a threat of social death, right? Like a ninth grader coming into high school, getting bullied by all their friends and are excluded because their friends in eighth grade now treat you like you don't exist, right? The threat of social death is pretty bad. Or you're a new legal associate and you've filed your first brief and all the partners are like, this is garbage. We're not going to send it to the client, right? Like all of a sudden, you're on trial socially in front of these people who could cut you loose at any time. That's a very vibrant social stressor that evokes the same kind of physiological response as we suppose a physical one would, right? And so we're very careful to distinguish in our studies a stressor from the stress response because often the stressor isn't really a bad thing. Getting critical feedback on your first legal brief as a junior associate, well, that could be awesome. It could be like, oh, great, I have these awesome partners at my great law firm are now giving me personalized feedback. That's useful. Or I'm a ninth grader and I have to make new friends, but I don't know, that's maybe you need new friends. Like that could be a good thing, right? And same with a test, same with, a presentation to senior vice president, whatever it is. Stressor is often in our daily lives are not good or bad. Now, of course, there's traumatic stressors that, are really bad for people. But then the appraisal is really where there's a lot of leverage. And if you think that the stressor is inevitably bad and that your response to it is always harmful, then it's really hard for you to think that you have the resources to meet the demand that you're facing. And you end up in this threat cycle. So in a lot of our research, what we try to do is give people a different story to tell themselves about a stressor and about their response. So that way they end up in a better place. Now, I don't know what that better language is, but I will say I once gave a talk at a middle school and a high school, and I used slides that Jeremy Jameson, who's my collaborator, had sent me that had the word arousal on it on every single slide. And that was a big mistake in a room of like middle school kids. So
right.
I'd strongly recommend different terminology. I was a middle school teacher. I should have known that you can't say that word in in high school. So.
Right. Yeah. I think that there needs to be a better language. I think if people of all ages understood the autonomic nervous system, this aspect of our nervous system that is on a continuum that leads us to either be, I guess at the extremes you would say, coma would be the deepest state of parasympathetic, non-arousal, then ascending from, very, deeply asleep, lightly asleep, groggy, awake and alert, awake and alert to the point of being, highly alert. And then you get into kind of low-level panic and then all-out panic attack, right? I mean, that's kind of the continuum, the autonomic continuum. I feel like if people understood that and they could simply ask, okay, where's my body and mind along that continuum, and then compare it to whatever it is they face, then we'd have a better sense of whether or not we were in the correct, maybe even optimal state for dealing with challenge or not. And along those lines, what is the optimal internal state for dealing with challenge that is just outside our ability? Maybe in an exam where I can naturally get 85% of the answers correct, but maybe 15%. I think this is what the machine learning and AI tells us is probably the appropriate level of difficulty for something in order to best learn. I know that's probably
it depends on if you're motivated. And if you think of the autonomic arousal on just one axis, where you start running into problems we find is that I think you're right that there's like, coma to like some arousal or meaningful arousal. but it's the middle to the end part where there's two different tracks. And one track is very high arousal, but you're terrified of the damage and defeat and the humiliation and the failure. And so that's demanding all your attention. That's what we call a threat type stress. There's another version that is, again, very high arousal, but that's like you're stoked and you feel confident you're going to do well. If you look at devices people are wearing to detect their stress, that might say high or low arousal, but it can't distinguish between super good, positive challenge type stress and really negative threat type stress. One of the examples that psychophysiologists like to say a lot, I got this from Jeremy Jameson, is imagine you're at the top of a double black diamond about to ski down. If you are a good skier, your heart rate isn't probably low. You're probably amped up. You're stoked. You're like, this is awesome. I can't wait to do this. You're fully confident. You're going to make all the turns and have a blast. If you're a terrible skier, you're just imagining the yard sale that's about to happen. You're about to crash. You're going to fall down the mountain. You might die. Also high arousal. If you're wearing like the regular watch that will just detect sympathetic nervous system activation, it wouldn't be able to tell the difference between really stoked to do something positive and terrified of crashing and dying. I like that example because often in social situations or performance situations, you want to be high arousal to perform your best, but you want your perception of that demand, the demand that's requiring your body to respond, to be matched with an equal belief or what we call appraisal of your resources to meet that demand. And that's kind of the magic. Because resources are appraised by the mind, in our interventions, we can give you a different way of viewing your resources so that way people feel like they can meet the demand, and that pushes them from a threat type response into a more challenge type response. You basically take the demand, which was your intense stress and worry, and turn it into a resource in your own mind. It turns out that actually helps people cope at a physiological level.
Do you think that striving reflects the action of a, kind of a basic neural circuit that then can be applied to other things, or lots of different things? The reason I ask is that, the notion of growth mindset is so attractive. It's such a sticky idea because one imagines, okay, if I can get really good at one thing, chess, then I can apply the same kind of relationship to the internal state of stress or arousal or what have you when trying to navigate a new environment of another kind, a physical practice or a relationship challenge or something of that sort. That, what we're really talking about here is an algorithm that can be directed at different pursuits, as opposed to growth mindset is applied in one context and not another. So what of that? People who are incredibly good at accessing growth mindset in one domain of life, does that mean that they'll be good at accessing growth mindset in another domain of life? What's the carryover or the spillover?
It's a great question. It comes up a lot. The Michigan State psychologist Jason Mosier studied this, and they measured growth mindset about your intelligence, the classic one, your personality, your morality, your social relationships, your emotions, etc. And the finding was that there is an overall association. If you think one trait can change and be developed, you tend to think another trait can be changed and developed. However, there's also very domain-specific mindsets. So there are people who think, yeah, I can get smarter, but I can't change my shyness. And other people who think, my relationships are never going to get better, but I can learn to play the cello. At what level should the intervention happen? If I only change your cello mindset, well, you're right. Like, what if cello isn't your thing in life? Now are you going to be fixed mindset for your relationships in school, and did I not really help you? I remember I was in graduate school at Stanford, and one of my RAs was so excited about our work, and he went to a party and talked about it. And he's like, oh yeah, math ability can change. You don't have to be dumb at math forever. And the person he talked to was so offended. She was like, are you telling me I could have done better in high school math and I just didn't try hard enough? My life could be different. I could be an engineer right now. Like, I like my life. Why are you telling? It went down this road of like, how dare you tell me it could have been different? And who knows, maybe he had bad delivery and had 14 margaritas, and who knows what happened. But I think the idea is like, if someone's got a reason to think about that fixed mindset as comforting in some way, that they don't have to feel bad about something that could have been different, it's probably not smart to go after that in a very specific way. If it's a domain that someone could be really defensive about, it's better to be a little vaguer about it, back up and do the more abstract mindset. But if someone's not defensive, generally the closer to the domain, the better, because they're going to see the application. Otherwise, they have to use it by analogy. And we know analogic reasoning is tough because it's hit or miss. If you're a leader, a manager, a coach, teacher, whatever it is, parent, it's very hard to simultaneously criticize somebody's work and motivate them to overcome and embrace that criticism. The leader, on the one hand, wants to maintain high standards by being critical, maybe in order to help the person grow, but that could crush the person's motivation. The alternative is withhold your criticism. Don't say the truth. Hide all the critical feedback and be nice and super supportive. And that meets your goal of being friendly and caring, but it doesn't help the person grow. And what Jeff Cohen and Claude Steele found in their initial study is that students were far more likely to view negative criticism as a sign that the teacher cared for them if it was accompanied by a transparent and clear communication of these two elements of high standards and high support. If it was just the critical feedback, the professor could have meant the same positive thing, I'm caring about you, but they didn't make it clear to the person, then participants were less likely to implement the teacher's critical feedback and to think that the professor was on their side. The magic of high standards and high support is not the 18 words. It's, I'm taking you seriously in a moment when you're vulnerable and I have power over you. That is just so deeply human and so powerful. But there's nothing about the magic words. It's the experience of dignity and respect when you are questioning whether you're either worthy of it or are going to be given it by authorities.
It's interesting. We had Dr. Becky Kennedy on here to talk about parenting. And she said many important things, but among them was the fact that children, perhaps all people, want to feel real and they want to feel safe.
Yeah.
An important concept that I think many people heard and are really internalizing. I know I am for sure. And this idea of feeling real has to do with not just feeling seen, but that people believe us, even if they disagree with us.
What I've been really taken by recently is Carol Dweck's secret life as a neuroscientist. She has this great psych review paper that contradicts a lot of received wisdom about the prefrontal planning regions of the brain and the kind of amygdala and the hippocampus, the affective regions and the memory creation regions. And the classic argument in going back to Plato and the Phaedrus is that the rational acting part of the brain plans out what it wants, makes all these calculations, and then has to tame the emotional part in order to make those goals into a reality. And so the emotion, the amygdala, the mesolimbic, that's this unruly horse that the charioteer has to harness. And I think that Carol argued, and I think other people have argued too, I've seen Adriana Galvan and Rondal and others argue this, that affective regions are often the teacher and the prefrontal is the student. And that makes sense if you think about how humans are goal-directed. Think about how a kid learns to walk. They don't do that for theoretical reasons. They don't just look at people walking and be like, I want to learn how to do that.
Right.
It's usually because there's a toy at the other side of the room that they really, really want and that I don't want them to have. And the only way for them to go get it, because I won't get it for them, is for them to learn how to walk. So the motor learning is the effect of the desire in the goal pursuit. And what Carol argued is that Phaedrus had is totally wrong. It's not that the prefrontal charioteer is taming the emotional. It's really that the affective part is training the prefrontal to be better at pursuing the goals that matter in the social milieu that you have. And a lot of people like Adriana Galvan and Jen Pfeiffer and Nim Tottenham in the adolescent space have shown this. Once the scanning studies were able to switch from fMRI focused on simple activation to studies looking at connectivity, where you could get temporal ordering, then you could start seeing actually that, especially in adolescence, it's the affective regions are training or teaching or telling the prefrontal regions what to do.
I completely agree that emotions drive the more, let's call it, tactical circuitry of the prefrontal cortex. Of course, we should be fair to the neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex is part of the limbic system. People often think because it's in the cortex, it's higher order, and that's simply not true.
In adolescence, you look around in your social milieu and see what counts for status, not in a superficial way, that sometimes happen, but often in a deeply meaningful way. What am I going to bring to the table?
One would hope.
And then,
I remember junior high school being far more superficial, but I'm 48, so I remember it in the kind of the John Hughes film era where people were very divided in terms of jocks and skateboarders and rockers and nerds. Now it seems a little bit more mishmashed. But I think also people will, in adolescence, I feel like kids find their niche and then try and excel within that niche.
Yeah.
As opposed to high school or junior high school being one huge hierarchy.
Yeah.
There's kind of these sub-hierarchies.
Yeah, Dan McFarland is a sociologist at Stanford, did this really interesting study with the ad health data And turns out you could characterize the social hierarchies in different high schools by kind of single pyramid high schools versus multi-pyramid high schools. And there's way better adjustment in the multi-pyramid high schools because there's many routes to status. The evolutionary psychologist Bruce Ellis talks about having many roles. For my book, I interviewed the NBA's best shooting coach. Chip England is his name. And he was at the San Antonio Spurs. Bill Barnwell had a great story about him, called him the shot doctor. How do you sell the vision to these players who are 18 to 21, are newfound millionaires? Everyone's saying you're the best, you're a first rounder, and they don't want to change their shot because if they do, they could mess it up, make it worse. It's like a golfer who's superstitious about their shot. And he's like, the number one thing I have to do is build trust, because I can't critique a player's shot and make them change it if they think they're going to sacrifice more. He doesn't say, if you don't change your shot, you are going to lose millions of dollars and be out of the league. He doesn't motivate with the fear of loss. He says, the average time in the league is 2.5 years. If you develop a great, reliable jump shot where even as your athletic talents decline, you're still reliable, you're talking about a 10-year career. I'm often reminded of something I heard from Ron Dahl, who's a neuroscientist at Berkeley. It's this polymath who can do everything and just so curious and generous. Ron likes to talk about these great studies of songbirds. If songbirds don't have testosterone when they are learning the mating calls, they don't do the over-the-top obsessive practice, so they don't master them, and then they don't mate and they die alone. What I find compelling is a beautiful new book by Mary Murphy called Cultures of Growth. And in her work, what she finds is that fixed mindset can be a cultural variable, like a more leadership variable, not just in the mind of the individual. And when that's the culture, then she finds people are more willing to try to make everyone else look like an idiot so that you don't get attacked. That's the summary finding. There's a kind of deflection strategy that if I trash other people for being idiots, then it'll make other people think twice before they mess with me. And so, but it creates the very toxic culture that they're trying to escape, which is the threat of their own, intelligence being attacked. So it's totally counterproductive. And she uses the example of Microsoft under the Ballmer era where you'd go into meetings and you'd get yelled at if you made any mistake and you weren't allowed to talk, and they would literally flip over a table and yell at you and people would leave the room crying. There's a lot of accounts of this as a very public information. And one of the things Satya Nadella did when he came in was to change what he said. He said, we have a culture of know-it-alls and we need a culture of learn-it-alls. And so Mary describes how in this culture of genius, she calls it, you don't just get the hypercriticism, the consequence of that is unethical behavior where you hide mistakes or lie about things because you're worried about being outed as not a genius. So the culture of fearing mistakes gives rise to the kind of unethical hiding type of culture. Boeing is another example where Calhoun, when he came in as a CEO, changed the incentive scheme at Boeing to be something called stack ranking, which is where you fire the bottom 10% every 6 months or a year. Whoa. Within your group. So if your group might be higher performing on average than some other group, but the bottom 10% of your group are getting fired. Okay. And this goes back to GE. It's a Jack Welch policy. The argument in Mary's book is that when you have organizations like that culture of genius, you hide mistakes and then you have unethical behavior in order to conceal those, and then you don't fix them. But in what she calls a culture of growth, you're willing to examine mistakes because they're not indicative of your overall inability to do well. They're part of the process of growing as a group.
Super interesting. You said Mary Murphy, Cultures of Growth?
Yeah.
It seems everybody worked with Carol Dweck. You, Claude Steele, Mary Murphy.
I have a small friendship group. And my favorite theorist on this is Dale Miller, is at the Stanford Business School. And he calls it the norm of self-interest. That if you look around, it looks like everyone's behaving for only very narrow, short-term, self-interested reasons. And because you think that's the norm, then you yourself kind of respond to those incentives. And then you, in turn, create that norm even more that other people see. But it's not a state of affairs that anybody really likes. Everybody kinds of prefers a pro-social world where people are helping others. But if you think that's just a really weird thing to do and not normal, then people conform to the wrong norm.
Thanks for listening to this installment of The Podcram. I hope it contains something useful for you. If you enjoy these selections and are curious about the curator's own thoughts, you can check out my other podcast, Psychic Lube, where I share concise concepts meant to grease the intellectual gears and help get your creative juices flowing. Each episode is an ongoing collaborative project that welcomes listeners to expand or rebut its points by email or comment, the most interesting of which get incorporated through periodic re-recordings. As always, if you're intrigued by today's content, I encourage you to go listen to the full podcast in its original form directly from its creators so that their sponsors keep paying them to make stuff for us and nobody feels compelled to sue me for copyright infringement. Now, get off your phone and go do smart stuff. Have a productive day.